Track 1. Hello, my name's Marianne Foster. The way this guided tour works is like this. Every now and again I'll be giving you instructions about where to go and when to stop, and then I'll hand over to John Grundy, who'll tell you more while you're on the road. Most of the time he'll tell you about things as you pass them or before you reach them, leaving you to stop and look as often as you want to. The guide's divided into tracks so you can stop or pause it after each section and start again as you set off on the next bit of the drive. John certainly won't be talking all the time you're on the road, so there'll be plenty of opportunities just to drive and enjoy the view. OK, I'm assuming you're either in Hexham or on the way to it. So to start the trip, find the big roundabout on the A69 that leads into Hexham. From there you'll need to drive west towards Carlisle for about half a mile and then filter right across the opposite carriageway onto the A6079, which is signposted to Acomb and Rothbury. I suggest you pause or stop the guide now and switch back onto track 2 when you've reached the A6079. Track 2.
The road that you're going to travel today is a remarkable road. It has an interesting history and it passes through and near some wonderful bits of the splendid county of Northumberland. The route we're recommending is about 50 miles long, so you could drive it no bother in about an hour and a half, but you would of course be a twit to do so, because that way you would miss so much of pleasure and interest. To be honest, you could easily spend 2 or 3 days on this journey, or even come back to it repeatedly over a lifetime, as I've done, and constantly find new things to enjoy. In a nutshell, the road goes from Hexham to Alnmouth, on the coast just beyond Alnwick. On the way, it crosses the Roman wall, it passes the 18th century glories of the National Trust property at Wallington, it stops at the unspoilt country town of Rothbury and gives you access to the extraordinary Victorian riches of Cragside and the manifold splendours of Alnwick before leaving you to cool your toes or possibly freeze your feet off if you're not a hardy northern soul in the North Sea. I have to warn you, though, that those are just the better-known highlights. As Robert Louis Stevenson said, to travel hopefully is better than to arrive, and the gaps between the highlights are as rich in delights as the big set pieces themselves. There are deep and verdant valleys and high bleak moors, crags and mountains. There are pretty villages and fascinating churches. There's a lot of emptiness. It's worth remembering that Northumberland is one of the largest counties in England. If memory serves me right, it's the 5th largest after, some others. Yorkshire, obviously, and Devon, Lincolnshire, maybe it's even Lancashire. But despite its size, its population is tiny, especially away from Tyneside and the extreme southeast of the county. So there's a whole lot of emptiness, unless you count the sheep. Rather unusually, this particular road has a name. It's called the Corn Road because it was built in the 1750s to transport corn from the rich farmlands of the Tyne Valley to the port of Alnmouth. The Tyne Valley is naturally a rich and fertile place, and by the middle of the 1700s it was producing a surplus of corn, leaving plenty spare which could be exported. The problem was that 18th century roads were rubbish, and to make it economically viable they had to provide a more reliable transport system. So they raised the dosh and they got permission from Parliament to build a turnpike, a toll road, and Bob's your uncle. Now, you might think that it would have been easier to transport the corn to the Tyne at Newcastle rather than build a 50-mile road across the moors to Alnmouth, and you'd be right. It would have been easier, but it would also have been more expensive. By the middle of the 1700s, Newcastle had an unshakable monopoly on the River Tyne, and it charged tolls, substantial tolls, on all goods that passed through the town. So the landowners and merchants around Hexham got together to pull a fast one, to sneak round the edges of Newcastle's jurisdiction and export their corn at a cheaper rate. Hence this road.
Just after the village of Wall, you'll come to Brunton Crossroads, where the Corn Road crosses the B6318. Take care crossing this major route and switch the guide back on when you're beyond the crossroads. Track 3. Now that you're past the B6318, continue on until you reach the Church of St Giles at Chollerton, a couple of miles after the crossing.
St Giles has a pretty little hearse house and stable by the gate into the churchyard, and inside the church the piers of the south aisle are snaffled Roman columns, reused in Norman times. They are monolithic, which means they were carved. Each of them was carved out of a single block of stone, which makes them very, very rare. In the churchyard south of the chancel is another interesting object. It's the grave of a man called Andrew Saint, who was the owner of a fulling mill. Now, fulling was a process in the manufacture of woolen cloth. The gravestone is carved with a picture of the mill, and it shows most of the processes involved, including the tenterfield, where the wet cloth was dried and stretched on hooks, called tenterhooks, which is where our phrase today comes from, to be on tenterhooks. Chollerton's actually not so much a village, it's more a collection of items strung along the road. Apart from the church, there's a fine railway bridge and there's a farm. The bridge was built in 1858 as part of the Border Counties Railway, which went up the North Tyne Valley. It had the distinction of being the only railway line never to make a profit, not even for a single day. And of course it was closed down in the 1960s, like so many others by Dr. Beechin. You won't reach Chollerton Farm until after the church, but you will catch glimpses of it through the railway arch and as you approach the church. It's worth noticing because it's huge, more of a small village than a single farm. You can still see the evidence of two sorts of power that once drove its threshing machines. There's the tower of a windmill from the early 19th century, and close by the chimney of the steam engine, which took over duties later in the century.
If you decide to have a look at St Giles, pause the guide now and start again on track 4 as you continue along the road towards Rothbury, as far as Crossroads at the A68. Track 4.
You'll be about to pass or just have passed the huge farm on the right. If you keep your eyes open for them, this is just one of many splendid farms on this route. I'll be talking about them again a bit later on, but it's worth getting into the habit of looking out for them, because many of them are beautifully built. Quite soon in this section of the road you'll pass your first glimpse of the world of Northumberland's aristocracy. On the left you'll see the entrance gates into the ground of the Swinburne Hall estate, one of the ancestral homes of the Riddle family, who were one of the chief families of landed gentry in the northeast. They had branches and houses all over the place. The lodge and archway that you'll pass were built in 1781, and they were the work of a Newcastle architect called William Newton. The mansion that he also built has been demolished, but the stable block and lots of other buildings survive. And soon you'll reach the A68, one of the major roads into Scotland nowadays. But this is not just any old normal highway. It follows the line of a Roman road. You get some indication as you cross it as to how straight it is, mile after mile without a bend. In the Middle Ages it was known as Deer Street, and it ran from York, or Eberacomb as we Romans called it, to Edinburgh, whose Roman name I've completely forgotten, if indeed I ever knew it or if it ever had one. It was built in 81 AD when the Romans still had some hope of conquering Scotland, before they'd been driven back by a combination of the midges and the whisky-flavoured marmalade provided by Scottish B&B landladies. It wasn't until 40 years later that Hadrian decided to abandon their northern ambitions and built the wall which settled the extent of the empire from then on.
Beyond the A68, the Corn Road continues on its way to Rothbury, though for some reason it changes its number and becomes the B6342. Pause the recording now, and once you've crossed the A68, switch back on, and John will tell you about the next section. Track 5.
Quarter of a mile after the A68, you'll drive past the road end of a tiny little village called Colwell, which is interesting because it's a very characteristic Northumbrian shape for a village. It's a single row of cottages facing south. The cottages are joined together in a terrace, but they're all different sizes and shapes and ages. Some of them are single story and some two. None of them are more than a couple of 100 years old in their present form, but they all have very long front gardens running down to the road through the village. They show every sign of being medieval tofts. When villages were being planned or laid out in the Middle Ages, each plot was given a cottage and a toft, an allotment of land which the villagers could cultivate for their own use. Anything from a quarter to half an acre were common. Colwell is a great example of one of the classic medieval village plans. It's a one-row village with added tofts. After Colwell, the view starts to hint at the wildness that you'll find later on. It rises slowly and it becomes a bit bleaker. North and south of the road lies some of Northumberland's forgotten landscapes. It's not so obvious on the road itself, which is pretty and lined with trees and hedges, but you can see plenty of wildness beyond. Roads here are tiny and very often gated, so you need a willing passenger or the patience of a saint to drive along them, and as a result the landscapes are rarely visited. For example, there's a place called Thockrington just to the north of the Corn Road. You'll come to a turn-off to it in a couple of miles' time. There's nothing at Thockrington but an isolated farm and a Norman church on a ridge, though all around the church there are humps and bumps that show that there was a more substantial village there once. It's an extraordinary place, purest Northumberland. The church is in the wildest of wild landscapes and remarkably isolated. Its interior is very simple but very beautiful, with two absolutely plain Norman arches set one behind the other. In the churchyard, just to the northwest of the church, lies Lord Beveridge, who was the architect of the British welfare state and the father of the National Health Service. He waged a lifelong war against what he described as the giant evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness. He was still fighting when he died. In fact, his dying words were, "I've got 1,000 things to do." He lived in a house on the coast near Beadnell, but his family still have, I think, a wonderful house up here on the fells, and so this is where he's buried. One of the most influential men in the history of modern Britain, lying in the heart of the moors on the edge of a quiet Northumbrian churchyard. If you watch out on the left, you should be able to catch a glimpse of the church high up on its ridge, and it is quite possible to take a detour up to see it.
About 2 miles after Colwell, there's a road off to the left that's signposted Thockrington 1 mile. You might want to take this short detour, but you need to be warned that the road is narrow and bumpy. It takes you through the farmyard, and you'll need to do a pretty tight 3-point turn opposite the church in order to get back down to the Corn Road to continue the trip. Whether you choose to go on or not, John will pick up the story of the Corn Road from the Thockrington Road end. Track 6.
When you reach the turn-off to Thockrington, you'll spot a ruined thing on a hill on the right-hand side of the road. Now, that's a technical phrase that we architectural historians use. This thing was a folly, an eye-catcher. It was built to look nice on the skyline, but it also doubled as a sort of grandstand for watching greyhound racing, apparently. And it was built in the early 18th century as part of a huge garden belonging to Bavington Hall. It seems to have been a magnificent place. There was a lake and a great double avenue of trees and a vast statue, the odd temple, and a romantic grotto built of strange, rough, cyclopean masonry. Sadly, the garden has nearly all gone now, just a few ghostly remains like the old thing on the hilltop. It was the property, Bavington was the property of a branch of the Shaftoe family, of Bobby Shaftoe fame, him who had silver buckles on his knee and went to sea, and was apparently bonny. Well, the Shaftoes built a gorgeous house, not huge, but one of my favourite Northumbrian mansions, tremendously powerful early 18th century architecture. You're probably approaching it now. The road curls around the trees which surround it, and you'll be able to catch a glimpse of it along the drive through trees on your right. I think Bavington's Lost Garden is worth mentioning because in the 1730s the Shaftoes borrowed a young gardener from their neighbour Sir William Lorraine at Kirkharle. His name was Lancelot Brown, but you can call him Capability. Capability Brown, the most famous landscape designer that Britain has ever produced. Capability Brown was born at Kirkharle, which is where you're heading now. He started his working life as a gardener for the family landlord, Sir William Lorraine. Even as a teenager, he seems to have been good enough to be loaned out by his boss to work here for the Shaftoes, and the vast ghostly relic of a garden at Bavington bears lots of the hallmarks of his later style. Sweeps of grass, clumps of trees, distant lakes, romantic grottos. That's what he became famous for later in life. And when you look at this area where he started, it's difficult not to feel that the vast sweeps of the Northumbrian landscape and the huge skies weren't the sources of his inspiration. Apart from Mr. Brown, Kirkharle has got all sorts of things that you might want to see and do. It has pies and potty stops and retail therapy, which is nice, but it's got a great deal more. It has a beautiful 14th century church and a monument to a man who, it says, was barbarously murdered by the Scots in 1483 on his way home from the church where he had been at his private devotions. But the main thing at Kirkharle is the courtyard, the little retail park created out of the old farm buildings. Northumberland came late to farm building. Right through the Middle Ages, Northumbrians were too busy duffing up Scotch people, or being duffed up in return to build decent farms, or indeed decent lives. For hundreds of years it was really tough up here. There was an Italian called Aeneas Sylvius who passed through Northumberland in 1435, and he described it as uninhabitable, uncultivatable, and horrible. Even 300 years later, the first Duke of Northumberland described the people that he met in the Cheviots as half-naked women dancing a wild measure, while the men, brandishing dirks, danced a war dance. Now, clearly, like any red-blooded male, I have spent much time seeking out these half-naked women, but without success. And that's because once the wars finally ended, Northumberland transformed itself and became more civilised. In the 18th century, Northumberland really seized the agricultural revolution that swept through the country. Estates embraced all the latest technologies. Writers at the time were always going on about the Northumbrian system of agriculture, and what they meant were improvements. Big new farms and selective breeding to improve stock, new crops, new sorts of cereals, growing turnips to feed animals over winter, improving irrigation and fertilising the soil. As a result, the county has a legacy of remarkable farms. Kirkharle is far from being the biggest, but it's nevertheless an excellent example. I used to be a listed building man back in the 1980s. I pottered around Northumberland deciding which buildings should become listed buildings. It was a fantastic job. But you know, it's almost impossible to remember now what a rubbish state the countryside was in at that time. Virtually every farm had buildings which were run down and underused. Most farmers felt that their old buildings were no use anymore. Country houses were empty and derelict, walled gardens had been abandoned, even estate cottages could be picked up with no bother at all. But look at them now. You can't heave a brick in the countryside nowadays without beaning some ex-townie who's living in a converted byre or cart shed. There are new-style rural industries up every lane. There are farm shops and coffee shops, garden centres. It's unbelievable. It's an unbelievable change. Country people have shown a fantastic level of initiative in reinventing themselves, and the farm buildings at Kirkharle are an excellent example. They've been converted in a wonderfully contemporary way, but without taking anything at all from their historic character. I hope you enjoy them a whole lot.
OK, we're rather assuming you might want to go and explore Kirkharle now that John's told you about it, and you might, of course, want a bit of a comfort break. Switch back on when you're ready to leave Kirkharle. Track 7. Continue on the B6342, cross the main road, the A697, still following signs towards Rothbury. On the way, you'll pass the great National Trust property of Wallington, where you might well want to stop. Just north of it is the beautiful estate village of Cambo, which is also worthy of attention.
Wallington's only about 3 miles from Kirkharle. In fact, pretty soon you'll be able to catch intriguing glimpses of it through the trees. So I haven't got time to tell you all 3 million things I want to say about it. So I'll just say that it existed in the Middle Ages. It was the home of the Fenwick family, who've gone on to found a chain of department stores which have done so much to provide us all with so many sofas and cheese scones and such like. But the present house was begun in 1688 by a man called Sir William Blackett from Newcastle, who'd made his fortune out of coal and lead mining and things. Sir William had a son also called Sir William. Why do posh families do that? And he was a bit of a lad. When I was a listed building man, I told you about that earlier, I came across a farmhouse further north in the county, which is quite remarkably posh inside. It's got a beautiful staircase and rich panelling and all the trimmings, quite unexpectedly grand for a Northumbrian farmhouse. Well, to cut a long story short, it turned out to have been the home of Sir William Blackett's mistress. It was his jewelled love nest, in fact, the naughty man beast. This second Sir William died without any legitimate children, so he left Wallington to his nephew, Walter Calverley, on condition that Walter A. changed his name to Blackett and B. married Sir William's illegitimate daughter Elizabeth. Now, Walter was clearly a man of taste and discrimination, and given the choice of changing his name and having a wife foisted on him or missing out on a terrific estate, he accepted the lot. To be fair, he also accepted the massive debts that William had left behind him. And to be even fairer, these two, Walter Calverley Blackett as he became, and his wife Elizabeth, gave us the house and the grounds that are here today, and jolly nice they are too. Because Walter turned out to be a man of extraordinary energy, a politician on the national and local stage, a public benefactor and a brilliant estate builder. Huge amounts of what you look at today can be laid at the feet of Sir Walter Calverley Blackett. He made his mansion marvellous, inside and out. He created wonderful grounds with glorious vistas and follies and lakes and deer parks and everything that the aristocratic gent could possibly need. He planted hundreds and thousands of trees, loads of which will still tower over you as you stroll through the woods. He created the exquisite walled garden. He built villages, rebuilt farms, laid out new roads. He built the spiffing bridge that'll take you across the River Wansbeck. And as you approach the house, you'll pass the east lawn and see the 4 terrific stone griffins' heads. They were provided by Sir Walter too. They came from London, from Bishopgate in fact, which was demolished in the mid-18th century, and they arrived here as ballast in one of Sir Walter's collier boats.
If you decide to visit Wallington, switch off now and return to the guide as you set off again. Track 8. After you leave Wallington, continue north on the B6342. It's worth turning off and stopping for a moment or two in the estate village of Cambo, 1 mile north of Wallington.
There's been a village at Cambo for a long time. Its name is of Celtic origins and refers to the ridge on which it's situated. In the church, which isn't very old in itself, there's a substantial collection of medieval stones. And at the end of the village street there's also a 16th century tower with hugely thick walls. So there was an old village here, but it had either shrunk away to virtually nothing, or it was pulled down and rebuilt by old Sir Walter in the 1740s. What he built was a mining village for the workers at his coal mine just west of the village. I'll tell you what, it doesn't look like a mining village now. It's become a beautiful estate village with gorgeous gardens and wonderful views south over the Wansbeck Valley and the glorious, simple pastoral landscape that's grown up around Wallington.
Track 9. From Cambo, return to the B6342 and continue north towards Rothbury.
While you're still driving across the northern reaches of the Wallington estate, I'd like to offer you an explanation of how it came to belong to the National Trust. What happened was this. In 1768, the estate passed to Sir Walter's sister Julia, who'd married a man called Sir John Trevelyan. And from that time, the Trevelyans were the force to be reckoned with at Wallington. In the 1870s, it became the property of Charles Edward Trevelyan. He was a politician who effectively set up the modern civil service, which was a good thing, but he was also in charge of relief during the Irish potato famine, and he certainly didn't cover himself with glory there. He believed, and I'm quoting him here, that God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, and that the famine was a mechanism for reducing surplus population. Not such a jolly chap. His son, G.O., George Otto Trevelyan, by contrast, was a nice man. He was one of the early supporters of votes for women. And he had 3 sons. The youngest was a remarkable man called Charles Macaulay Trevelyan. He was a great historian. He almost invented the idea of social history. He believed, he said, in 3 things: poetry, history and solitary walks. His idea of a solitary walk was 25 miles a day. He used to say, I've got 2 doctors, my right foot and my left foot. So it's no surprise that he was a founder member of the YHA, the Youth Hostel Association. Their HQ is called Trevelyan House after him. His elder brother, the 3rd Baronet, was also a remarkable man, but for an aristocrat he was much odder. He wasn't just left-wing, he was very, very left-wing. He was a pacifist in the First World War. He was a founder member of the Labour Party. He was Labour MP for Newcastle in the 1920s, and he was the Minister of Education in the first Labour government. He gave up politics after he lost his seat, but he never gave up his principles. In the Second World War, he shocked people by painting a crown on one of his gateposts and the hammer and sickle on the other. He was a real egalitarian. On one occasion he said, I am no friend of the system which by pure chance makes me rich and 1,000 others poor, and I regard myself not as the owner of Wallington, but as a trustee of a property which could belong to the community. It's good stuff. He gave the place to the National Trust in 1941, the Trust's first country house property, and still the largest country house estate in the Trust's possession. OK, moving on. It's quite a while since I mentioned the road itself, the Corn Road, the turnpike. But in this section north of Cambo, it's particularly obvious that it used to be a toll road, planned and built at a particular time. The clue is the straightness. For mile after mile there are no bends. Width is another clue. The road is broad for a country road and the verges are generous, at times extremely generous. The reason it's so straight and broad is that there was nothing in the way when it was built. There were no existing roads and no existing fields to work round. The road was built across open moorland, and the next few miles are still wild enough to give you a flavour of it. Milestones are another clue, and this road is still richly endowed with its original 18th century milestones. If you spot one, you'll spot all the others. There are a number of things worth watching out for in this next section of the road, apart from the beauty of the landscape, that is. The first is a folly that you'll see looming like a ruined castle on the horizon away to your right. It's called Rothley Castle, and it was built by old Sir Walter Calverley Blackett in 1755. It was part of his deer park. The story is that while the chaps were off hunting the deer, the ladies would sit in the shade of the castle, like spectators at a football match, cheering them on or decorously supping cups of tea. The 18th century traveller Arthur Young says that from time to time the chaps would dress up as knights and the ladies as medieval damsels and turn the whole event into a sort of tournament, which he thought was a bit OTT, but which sounds spiffing fun to me.
At the end of a long straight bit of road about 4 miles from Cambo, and with Rothley Castle off to your right, you'll come to a crossroads. It's called Rothley Crossroads, and it's where the Corn Road met another turnpike, the Morpeth to Steng Cross turnpike, which also opened in the 1750s. The road to Morpeth goes straight ahead, but you need to turn left towards Rothbury.
At Rothley Crossroads there's quite a rare survival from the turnpike days, an original stone guidepost. The finger posts have gone, unfortunately. I would put pretendy ones back in, but the post remains, an original 18th century signpost, the only one in Northumberland. Just after the Crossroads there's another folly, and this one you do pass close by. It's called Codger's Fort, and it was built in 1769. There are two versions of its purpose. One is that it was built as an actual fort in case the Scots were to rebel again as they'd done in 1745 and march this way. There's an architect's drawing of Codger's Fort in the house at Wallington, which is titled Battery for 5 guns, with storeroom proposed to be built. Sounds real, doesn't it? But it seems a bit much still to be worrying about the Scots as late as 1769. Who can tell? Perhaps it was just a picturesque folly. In the valley below it there are 2 lakes, created by Capability Brown at about the same time as Codger's Fort. They're called Rothley Lakes, and you'll drive right between them. They mark the last part of the romantic landscape of Wallington.
Track 10.
OK, so that's the end of Wallington and the Blacketts and the Trevelyan's, and now you'll be climbing into wilder and even emptier country. For the next 5 miles or so you'll be driving through an area that used to be known as the Rothbury Forest, even though there aren't many trees. It's high country this, and wild, with splendid distant views, among the wildest and least visited parts of the county. In the distant past, in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was notorious and dangerous country, bandit country. It was one of the haunts of the border reivers, the cattle thieves. All of the farms that you'll pass have been rebuilt since those days, but when you study them carefully or follow up their history, virtually every one of them shows signs of having been fortified once. Away to the east on your right, and 30 miles away at least, you'll catch glimpses of the sea from time to time. Ahead and to your left every now and again, you'll get sudden and glorious views of the Simonside Hills. Simonside itself is flat-topped and instantly recognisable. Do you know, I love this bit of the road. This is big, empty country. The Hexham poet Wilfred Gibson wrote that it was a place where time falls in solitary places, calm and slow, where pipes the curlew and the plover calls beneath an open sky.
We're going to suggest you take a detour off the Corn Road, which will provide an alternative route into Rothbury. About a mile after you pass the Gate pub, you'll see a brown tourist sign pointing towards Simonside. Switch off now and enjoy the beauty of this wild area. Switch back on to track 11 when you reach the turn-off to Simonside. Track 11. Turn off left, following the brown tourist sign to Simonside. After leaving the Corn Road, follow the steep and narrow road up through a wood, past the entrance to a farm, and watch out for the car park on the right-hand side of the road. This is Lordenshaw car park, and we think it's worth stopping here for a while.
Looking down on Lordenshaw car park from the west is Simonside, just under 1,400 feet high, and with glorious views from its summit. But a few yards northeast of the car park is a lower hill, with views almost as great, and on top of it you'll find the Iron Age hill fort of Lordenshaw. In the Iron Age, between about 700 or 800 BC, until the time of the Romans, there were thousands of hill forts built in the British Isles. They're almost always on the top of hills, or carved out at the end of ridges with clear views over the surrounding countryside. They're always encircled by a defensive ditch or ditches. Northumberland has dozens of them, and the interesting thing is that the hills here must have been much more densely populated in those days than they are today. And because Northumberland has been sparsely populated and barely farmed since they were occupied, many of our hill forts have been less damaged by time and are among the best examples in the country. Lordenshaw is one of these. The view from its hilltop is positively spiffing. Presumably they chose the site for defensive reasons, but it's impossible to believe that on a nice sunny evening they weren't blown away by the beauty of the scene. It has only got one ditch, which makes it known as a univallate fort. And its ramparts, though they're not what they would have been 2,000 years ago, are still very clear. Indeed, on one side, the stone facing of the walls is still intact and very dramatic indeed. Round about the area of the fort, there are examples of prehistoric art, which were ancient even by the time that the fort was built. There are dozens of cup and ring marked stones, bits of the exposed sandstone bedrock, which have been decorated with grooves and circles and spirals. Patterns like these are to be found all over the world, and they were done in the late Neolithic period. That means about 5,000 years ago. Northumberland is one of the richest places in the world for cup and ring markings, and it's impossible not to be moved by them. They're always in such splendid and isolated places, and they are so rich in mystery and atmosphere.
Once you've seen all you want of Lordenshaw, move on to track 12. Track 12. Turn right out of the car park and continue on the small road until you come to the hamlet called Great Tosson, where you'll see the ruins of a medieval tower house and a small car park with an information board.
My feeling about any great drive is that it needs to have at least one ooh moment, and I'd like to think that you're going to achieve one of these as you leave Lordenshaw and come over the top of a little hill and discover the Coquet Valley laid out before you, and the Cheviot Hills stretching away into the distance. I've known people with hearts of stone who've still gone ooh as they first met this view. The road from here descends through plantations of conifer woods. Northumberland is rich in conifer woods, and there are people who criticise them, but not me. I know they're not native to the county. Ancient Northumbrian woods are filled with dwarf oak trees and alder and silver birch. You passed through a surviving wood like this when you left the Corn Road on your way up to Lordenshaw. But this conifer woodland has tremendous atmosphere too. Below the trees you begin to get views of Rothbury away to your right, and at the bottom of the hill is the hamlet of Great Tosson, which has got a couple of characteristic Northumbrian farmhouses. And there's a ruined medieval tower house as well. Most of its outer stonework has been robbed away to build the farmhouses and the farms round about, so what's left is the massive inner core of the walls. It was built in the 1330s and it belonged to the Ogle family, which is another of the great names of Northumberland. In the wars with Scotland, the Coquet Valley here was clearly a dangerous place because there are several towers like this round about, and there were more in the past. There are still two others at Whitton just to the east, and another at Heppel a couple of miles down the valley.
Track 13. To leave Great Tosson and head for Rothbury involves almost doubling back on yourself and continuing down the hill past the plainer of the two farmhouses. Follow the signs towards Rothbury.
This narrow, twisty, deep-laned road below Great Tosson has quite an ancient feel. I tend to associate such deep lanes with places that have an ancient Celtic background. Now, you just come down from the ancient Celtic hill fort at Lordenshaw, and there are many other ancient bits and pieces on the hills all around. The ancient Britons, the Celts, lived on the hills, and the hills are laced with trackways that connected the old forts. The river in the valley, the Coquet, that's a Celtic name too. But Rothbury, beside the river, that's got an Anglo-Saxon name. It means Rother's farm or settlement, and it's probable that old Rother the Saxon colonised and cleared the wetter, more wooded land in the valley bottom. What is clear is that the Saxons built a church, though none of it stands above ground anymore, except for one thing in the present parish church, which is worth hobbling a couple of 100 yards on blisters to make sure that you've seen. It's the base of the font, which is part of a really splendid Anglo-Saxon cross. I'm a touch worried that you'll look at it and think that I'm going on a bit, because it isn't a very big bit of a cross. It's just about 3 feet of roughly carved stone, but it has all the sort of decorative motifs that you see in Anglo-Saxon art. There's a vine scroll and there are bits of knotwork and so on. But the best bit has a carving of God in majesty, Actually, it's only got his knees and his feet. His upper body has been cut off, but you can tell that he's sitting on a throne with his feet resting on a cushion. What makes this little fragment so special is that the carving of God looks absolutely natural and real, like a proper human being. It was carved about the year 700 AD, and in the Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, art was at its highest point. On Lindisfarne the Gospels were being illustrated. In Jarrow the Venerable Bede was writing with beauty and genius, and stone carvers like the man who did the Rothbury cross were producing works which were more skilful and civilised than anywhere else in Europe. Saxon Northumberland wasn't a backwater on the edge of the country like it often seems nowadays. It was one of the centres of European civilisation. The cross is the only important monument in Rothbury, but in all other respects the town is such a nice place that it seems absurd to treat it as a mere pause on a day's drive. It's awash with coffee shops and pub lunches. There are pies aplenty, and a nice assortment of real shops selling real things. It's pretty too, with an accidental beauty caused by its wildly asymmetric green. The row of houses along the north side is yards higher than the south row, and the green slopes dramatically, enriched by irregular clumps of old trees. It makes for a fascinating piece of townscape. The buildings are nice too. There's nothing to blow you away individually, but nothing to irritate you either. Nothing nasty has ever been built here. There are just lots and lots of well-built 18th and 19th century houses in local stone.
The main car park in Rothbury is on the left beside the river as you approach the town. From it, a footbridge leads up into the town with its pubs, cafes and shops. Switch back on when you're ready to leave Rothbury. Track 14. To continue your trip, turn left out of the car park and then left again to cross the stone bridge. At the T-junction, turn right and follow signs for Alnwick. After about 2 miles, you'll pass the entrance to the extraordinary National Trust property of Cragside.
Cragside is just so fantastic, so important. There haven't been many times when the North East was at the centre of national events. It was when the Romans defined it as the edge of their empire and built the wall. It was, as I've just said, in Anglo-Saxon times. And it was in the Victorian era, when northeastern power and inventiveness was changing the world. Just think of the things that came out of the northeast in those days. Railways, of course, electric light, hydraulic power, the electric light switch, the steam turbine. So many of these things are represented in the story of Cragside and of Lord Armstrong who built it. There's a story they tell how once on the River Tyne, the largest hydraulic bridge in the world opened to allow the largest ship in the world to sail to the largest factory in the world, to collect the largest crane in the world, and all of them were the works of one man. Lord Armstrong's energy was carried on into his home. He had a massive house in Newcastle as well, but he acquired Cragside as his holiday home initially, as a place to go fishing and play the country gent. He built a smallish country house in the 1860s, and in the next 30 years expanded and glorified it. He's said to have planted 7 million trees, for example. Not on his own, of course. He obviously got the chaps to do it for him. But the estate that he created is an extraordinary place. The house itself was the first in the world to be lit by hydroelectric power, and one of the first to have electricity at all. It's also an absolutely magnificently romantic house. Its setting is extraordinary, and if you haven't got time to see it on this drive, you'd better come back, or else.
If you decide to explore Cragside, switch off now and continue when you set off to Alnwick. Track 15.
The road beyond Cragside will take you up through a few of Lord Armstrong's 7 million trees, high over Debden Moor. As you get beyond the trees, you emerge out into genuine moorland. If you were driving in the opposite direction, the road would offer you glorious views of Simonside, But worry not, because once you've reached the very top of the hill, the view's not bad in this direction either, with Callerley Crags off to the left, and views all the way to the sea spread out in front of you. It's a perfection of natural beauty, except for the pylons, of course, and possibly the white golf ball-like structure on the far horizon, which is part of the country's early warning radar system, associated with the NATO base at Bulmer on the coast. Soon you'll reach the A697, which is one of the main roads to Scotland. It's an interesting place, this Crossroads, because it is another intersection between two 18th century toll roads, Acomb Road and the Morpeth to Coldstream Turnpike. The modern line of the A697 is in fact a really early road improvement scheme. The original line of the road went over the hill just before the intersection. It's a public bridleway now, and you can still follow it for a couple of miles. Makes a fascinating walk over Rimside Moor. And if you did, you'd walk on the original 18th century road surface, past the ruins of a coaching inn. But in 1828, the Turnpike Trust improved the road and produced the New Cut, the modern line of the A697, to avoid the difficult hills and to bypass the village of Whittingham. Isn't that exciting? I thought you'd be excited.
Track 16. After you've crossed the A697, continue on towards Alnwick for about 2 miles, until you see a sign on the left that says Edlingham, a quarter of a mile. In the village of Edlingham, park beside the church.
Talking of Edlingham and Whittingham, there are lots of places ending in INGHAM in Northumberland. A suffix like that on a name is evidence of an Anglo-Saxon settlement, and it sort of means farm belonging to. Such names are common all over the country, and they're usually pronounced Ingham, like in Birmingham. Only in Northumberland does the pronunciation change and become Ingham, as in Whittingham, or indeed Edlingham. Edlingham is a really worthwhile detour. It's got a church and a ruined castle and an abandoned railway viaduct all in a row, and all objects of great historical and romantic interest. The viaduct was on a beautiful branch line that was built in the 1870s and cut across from Alnwick to Cornhill via Wooler. The church is old, probably Norman, but possibly even Anglo-Saxon, and the castle is one of the most important small castles or medieval manor houses in Northumberland, partly because it's splendidly built, but also because it tells an important story. People used to think that Northumberland was full of peel towers, solitary towers that were built in the Scottish Wars, and that when the wars finally ended, more comfy houses were added to the original peel tower. In fact, what happened almost every time was the exact opposite. At Edlingham, and lots of other places in the county, the owners built themselves a fairly normal medieval house. At Edlingham it was like a mini castle with a hall and a gatehouse and walls, and then later, quite a bit later, they added a tower. Some people think they did it for extra defence as the wars got worse. Some people think it was just the fashion. "Oh, I see old Sir Whatsit has built himself a tower. I'd better build one myself to keep up with the times." It was probably a mixture of both reasons, but the tower at Edlingham is too posh to have been just concerned with defence. It had a magnificent interior, including great vaulted stone ceilings and splendid carved fireplaces. So at the very least it was built partly to show off. It belongs to English heritage now, and rather excitingly, it costs nothing to get in and is open throughout the year at all reasonable times. And you can't say fairer than that.
Track 17. Just about half a mile beyond Edlingham is the overview called Corby's Crag, where there are a couple of unmarked lay-bys with a park bench. We recommend you pause here and let John tell you a bit about the landscape. You might also want to walk down the hill a little to the bridge, just behind which is a beautiful waterfall.
The land that makes up Northumberland started life as part of a huge lake on the edge of what is now Scotland. And over vast periods of time, rivers from the north emptied sand and silt into the lake. The sand got deeper and deeper and got compressed into stone. So now the county is covered with a layer of sandstone thousands of metres thick. Here at Corby's Crag, you're on top of sandstone just like you were at Simonside and Lordenshaw. All of the buildings that you've seen so far have been built of sandstone. Every cliff, every crag that you've seen so far has been made of sandstone. Northumberland is a sandstone county, except for two things. Really late in geological time, there was a huge volcanic event which split through the sandstone in a long line right across the county, and it left behind a great series of ridges of black volcanic rock called dolerite. The Roman wall in its dramatic central section is built along this ridge, and Northumberland's coastal castles, Dunstanburn, Bamburgh and Holy Island, are built on cliffs of the same outcrop. It's called the Great Whin Sill. But the other event that altered the appearance of Northumberland can be seen in front of you here at Corby's Crag. The hills in front of you are the Cheviots, which are not made of sandstone. They were formed by a volcanic eruption which pushed the overlying sandstone up into a huge dome, and gradually, over millions of years, the softer sandstone on top of the dome got eroded away, leaving the much harder volcanic rock behind. The remaining sandstone has been left in a ring of ridges circling round and facing towards the Cheviots. The rock that you're sitting on would once have continued on, soaring on upwards to form part of a huge dome over the mountains in front of you.
When you've finished in this lovely place, continue on towards Alnwick, which is a wonderful town packed with entertaining things to do. Track 18.
The architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner described Northumberland as the castle county of England. And it's true, there are more castles of more types in Northumberland than you could shake a stick at in a month of Sundays. The reason is pretty clear. Northumberland was on the front line of a war against Scotland that went on for 300 years. Edward I declared war against the Scots in 1296, and it wasn't until 1603, when England and Scotland became one country, that the fighting began to draw to a close. Actually, in Alnwick it lasted longer than that. There's a cross just north of the town which marks the spot where the Scottish king Malcolm was killed while attacking the town in 1093, and another that marks where William the Lion was captured in 1174 doing the same thing. So Alnwick spent a long time in the wars, and it's had a castle since 1157. But since 1307 it's been the property of the Percy family, who ever since then have been the principal family of Northumberland, at times effectively the kings of the north. First of all there were 3 Lord Percys, and then there were 11 Earls of Northumberland, and then, since 1750, there have been 12 Dukes of Northumberland, all of them Percys. The present one is called Ralph, or Rafe, I believe is the pronunciation. I met him once. He opened the door for me when I was going to do a radio interview with his mum, who was the Duchess at the time. He seemed a nice young man, and his mum was nice too. She had the reputation of being a great washer-up after Women's Institute dues. She said that the worst thing about living in a castle was that your hot milk had gone cold by the time you got it to bed. We interviewed her in the library of the castle, which is an extraordinary room. Alnwick is still a fantastic medieval castle, but from about 1850, the 4th Duke redid all of the interiors in the style of an Italian Renaissance palace, and it's fabulous. Absolutely no expense was spared, and the art and the furniture, there are Titians and Tintorettos, Van Dycks, Canalettos. There's a wonderful self-portrait by Andrea del Sarto. I'm sure it must be the best collection of old masters still in private hands. Well, anyway, the library where we interviewed the former Duchess is gorgeous, but we interviewed her in the middle of winter when the castle wasn't open to the public, and it had been changed from a grand formal stateroom into a family lounge. There was a game of Scrabble on a table in front of one of the fireplaces, and a gorgeous revolving Regency bookcase had been stripped of its books and filled with videos. There was a big telly beside another fireplace. Do you know, I wanted to become a duchess. Some of the most famous Percys were never dukes or earls. Harry Hotspur was the son of the 4th Earl, but he was killed in 1403 at the Battle of Shrewsbury before he ever got the chance to be an Earl himself. He won his spurs and became Hotspur at the siege of Berwick Castle in 1383. The castle was only defended by 48 men, all elderly, and it held out for 8 days. All 48 were put to death when they surrendered. And how old was Harry when he won his spurs? He was 12. He should have been at school, unless he was. Perhaps it was national curriculum pillaging. So, they've been a big family, and they still are. They own vast swathes of Northumberland and pretty huge estates elsewhere. Whether that's a good thing or not depends on what your politics are, and I'm sure people are utterly divided about their value to the county. But whatever you think, you can't ignore them. For centuries they were almost the kings of the north, and they're still utterly a force to be reckoned with.
As you enter Alnwick, you'll see a sign that says, "For tourist attractions, follow P." This is good advice. So enjoy Alnwick, and when you're ready to head for the last leg of our journey, switch back on again. Track 19. Right, now it's time for the last leg of the journey. Head south out of the centre of Alnwick. Continue past the splendid column with a lion on top, and at the mini roundabout, bear left on the A1068, which is signposted Ashington.
Northumberland is roughly divided in two. There's the mountainous west, which you've just transected, and the flatter east flanking the North Sea. And as you leave Alnwick, you're also leaving the hills, and you'll find yourself in less dramatic countryside than you have become used to. You'll also find yourself on a more major road system than you've used so far. From now on, all signs of the old turnpike road have long since been obliterated. You'll cross over the A1, which used to pass through the middle of Alnwick, but now thankfully bypasses it, though it does cut right through the middle of a landscape created by Capability Brown in the 1770s. A mile or two later you'll pass under the main East Coast Railway line, and the reason for all of these things is that you are now down on the Northumberland coastal plain. The coastal plain was always the easy route between England and Scotland, which explains why the main transport links are there today, and why there are so many castles on this east side of the county. This is Duke of Northumberland country. Every farm belongs to the Percys, and virtually every older cottage as well. You'll pass two quite splendid farms at Alndyke and a little further on at Hawk Hill. Whole villages belong to the Duke, loads of them, including the village of Lesbury, which you'll bypass using what is probably the most overblown and self-important modern bridge in Northumberland. And finally, you'll find yourself heading towards the sea, towards Alnmouth, at the mouth of the River Aln, the end and the destination of the Corn Road.
At the roundabout, turn right towards Alnmouth. In the village, follow the parking signs which will take you down to the beach. When you're there, John will join you for the last time. Track 20.
Alnmouth had existed as a port long before the 1750s when the Corn Road was built. In fact, I'm going to quote you the beginning of a description of it from Arthur Mee's King's England, which I think is out of copyright, so I shouldn't get into trouble. He says that it was set up as a seaport by William de Vesky about 1150. William de Vesky was one of the early owners of Alnwick, so it was set up as a port for Alnwick. And he says, when John Wesley rode here in 1748, he called it a small seaport town, famous for all kinds of wickedness. Do you know, it's very much like that today. You can have a wicked cup of tea in one of the tea shops, or a wicked pub lunch. You can have a wicked paddle in the North Sea if you can stand the pain, or a wicked stroll along the sands. I realise I'm in danger of sounding like Jamie Oliver, so moving swiftly on, let me say that Alnmouth's a lovely little town, rich in all the delights that I've just implied, and full of pretty sights and buildings, some of them just a touch surprising. For example, as you approach the town from the landward side, there's a really pretty row of brightly painted cottages on the ridge facing the river. They look Georgian, but they're not. They're among the earliest concrete buildings in Britain, built of block concrete in the 1860s and painted in pretty colours to look pretty. In the town there are quite a lot of things that aren't what they seem. There are a number of big buildings, for example, that look like terraces of cottages or public halls or nonconformist chapels. In fact, that's what they've become, but what they started out as were granaries to store the grain that was carried along the Corn Road. Prospect Place along the side of the churchyard is one of them, though it looks like a row of 19th century cottages now. The Marine House Hotel is another, and further south the Hindmarsh Hall, which looks entirely churchy, was another, and there are probably others that I haven't noticed. So you can tell that the Corn Road did its job. It undoubtedly delivered corn to Alnmouth. One final bit of evidence is that the main street is called Northumberland Street now, but it used to be Hexham Street, as a reminder of the other end of the road that brought the town wealth. Now I'm assuming that your visit to Alnmouth will be a fresh and invigorating one and not too niffy. Ozone perhaps, but no unpleasant pongs. I mention this because if you look across the river at the south end of the town, you'll see a sand dune with a cross on top, and below it a building which used to be a guano shed. Guano was, bird poo to be brutal. It used to be imported here from Peru and turned into fertiliser. Apparently it smelt appalling, hence the placing of the guano shed well away from the rest of the village. Mind, that can't have helped the sailors on the guano boats. What a job that must have been. Alnmouth was never a big port. The entrance to the river was too shallow, and even for small ships in the past it was only accessible at high tide. It got a bit easier after Christmas Day 1806, when a tremendous storm changed the course of the river and gave it the more direct route around the back of the village that you see today. But the port was never going to survive in the changed world of Victorian times, and by the mid-19th century roads in the Tyne Valley had improved, the railways had come. After 1850 the River Tyne had ceased to be controlled by Newcastle, and so the Corn Road lost its economic role and it started to drift gently to the quiet back road that you've been on today. If you've looked at everything on it, I suspect it's about 6 weeks since you set off. If you haven't, I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen and that you'll be back in the future to catch up on what you've missed.